I'm here with Hank O'Neill, and we're going to talk about his creation and something that's brought a lot of pleasure to people, Chiaroscuro Records.
Hi, Michael. Let's talk about Chiaroscuro Records. What would you like to know?
Where did you get the... I know you had the idea to make records. Before Chiaroscuro, you were recording for Johnson McREE?
The very first record that I worked on that was live music and live musicians was with Johnson McREE. He was a festival producer. He was actually a CPA and a really good one, but a festival producer in the Washington, D.C. area. He lived in Manassas, Virginia, and he had an event that ran for many years called the Manassas Jazz Festival. And it was about 1968. I had already come to New York City, and Johnson said that he wanted to make a record. Maybe it was 67, but it was in that range. He wanted to make a record featuring ZUTTY Singleton. And he was going to round up some really good guys, and he didn't know exactly where he was going to get any equipment or anything like that. And I said, well, I can help you with that, because my friend Squirrel Ashcraft had a big, beautiful Ampex, and he had 2 microphones, and I figured that was about all we needed. So I talked to Squirrel. He said, be my guest. We sorted out a few things. Johnson put together a band that included ZUTTY and Tommy Gwaltney and Sammy Remington and Slide Harris and Bob Green and ZUTTY and Steve Jordan. But anyway, put together this band. I put together an Ampex, I think it was called an F44, quarter-track stereo machine, and 2 Electro Voice microphones, one of which was on a stand, regular microphone stand, the other of which was on a desk stand. It was no bigger than this. Squirrel used to keep that on the piano if he wanted to record something that he was playing. So the desk stand didn't really work very well because it would have put it about a foot off the floor. And so I got a stool that somebody could sit on, but instead of putting somebody's bottom on it, we put the Electro Voice desk stand on it. And I positioned them where I thought it would make sense on the stage of the Manassas High School, Osborne High School auditorium, and everybody played. And it was kind of a ragtag session. I mean, the music was absolutely spectacular. The ZUTTY was phenomenal, as he always was, but did the whole thing just by looking at needles. I was so green I didn't even have headphones, but everybody played well. And I remember the last song, they decided they wanted to do one more song, and literally when they finished the last track, which was the song Chinatown, I probably had 3 feet of tape left. It just, and then just spun off. And one of the main things I remember about that date was, besides the music being really good, I mean, ZUTTY was the kind of person, I mean, not only did he have an infectious personality and everything, but he could almost play melodies on the drum. I mean, you could actually hear the song as he was doing his solos. And at the date, there was in the high school auditorium, in the front row, there were probably half a dozen people, and one of the people who was in the front row, I had a girlfriend in the front row who somebody else in the front row was trying to bird dog, and didn't work. But sitting next to her or 2 seats away was one of the people who wound up getting in bad trouble because he was E. Howard Hunt, one of the Watergate guys. And so the session worked out, and everything was, because Hunt was a jazz fan. The session worked out well, and when it was all over, I was taking things apart, and I remember the Ampex was about, I don't know, 3 feet wide. It was a big machine. And I picked it up off the lip of the stage and bent over to put it down on the floor, and my pants ripped from front to back with everybody in the front row watching. That happened. And that was the first session. But the record came out very well. And I believe that Johnson eventually sold that to George Buck or somebody many years later. And it was reissued by Buck on LPs or CDs or something. But it was a nice record. Johnson had absolutely not a clue about how to do this kind of thing. And so, but I had contacts with pressing plants and all, because I had already made 2 or 3 records with Squirrel Ashcraft that we gave away using tapes from his old sessions in the 40s and 30s and 40s, and then more recent sessions that we had done in the 60s. So I knew how to walk it through and how to design a cover. It was really a pretty terrible cover design, but it had a piece of cardboard and held the record. But that was the first one, and was already in New York, and was chasing musicians and chasing music and things like that. And by good fortune, I had a friend. I had only a handful of friends here in New York City, but one was Marion McPartland, who was married to Squirrel Ashcraft's closest buddy from Chicago, a guy named Jimmy McPartland. And they weren't living together any longer. They had sort of separated. Marion lived in New York and Jimmy lived out on the island. But Marion in turn, and then through the government as well, I met Sherman Fairchild, and by the late 68 or something like that, began recording things in Sherman Fairchild's living room. That's a name that many people have forgotten, but in 1932, Sherman sold a little bit more of his stock and started a company that was called Fairchild Recording Products, and which he still had in one shape or another in the late 60s. And he built tape recorders, and he built amplifiers, and he built limiters and things like that. And today you can still buy a Fairchild limiter if you can find one and spend $20,000 on it, because they were tube things that were really very, very good. In any event, Sherman was a music fan and had been for many, many years. He had actually had a publishing business with Gene Austin. And it was at Sherman's house I first met Willie the Lion Smith and people like that. And we hit it off, and Sherman said, if you want to use my studio to record people, be my guest, and we did. And it ranged all the way from blues singers like Blind Gary Davis and white blues singers like John Hammond and musicians like Bud Johnson or whoever needed or classical people. He had 2 back-to-back Steinway L's, and they were always in perfect shape. And he had a small room up above the living room where you there were lots of tape recorders and everything you needed to make a record. So that's where I taught myself engineering, at Sherman Fairchild's house. And sort of towards the beginning of '69, Marion was having a hard time having anybody pay attention to her at all in terms of making records. This was at a time where, organ trios and funk and this and that were predominant, and Blue Note wasn't making the kind of records you think of as a Blue Note record. They were, doing guitars and organ players and things like that. And we were just sitting around talking one day, and we decided to make a little record company that was 1/3 Sherman Fairchild, 1/3 Marion McPartland, and 1/3 me. And we capitalized the company at $1,500. And Sherman was going to provide the facilities, and Marion and I were going to provide ideas, and I was going to provide how to run a tape recorder, because Sherman was old by then and he couldn't get up the stairs to the place where the recorders lived. And the first record, and we were going to name the company Halcyon, which was the name of Marion's, it was her name. And she had a brother-in-law or somebody design a beautiful label, had a little bird on it and stuff. And the first things that were actually recorded that came out, not the first things that were recorded, but was the date with Bobby Henderson, which Marion didn't really know about because she didn't know who Bobby Henderson was. I barely knew who Bobby Henderson was, but I had gone over to see John Hammond about something, and John was all excited, and as he always seemed to be when he would find a new artist, but in this case it wasn't a new artist, it was an old artist. And he says, "I want to play you a tape," and I said, "Good." He put it on, and here was this rollicking, wonderful piano, out of tune a bit, but a good piano player. And he says, "I'll bet you don't know who that is." And I said, "Of course I know who it is." He says, "How would you know that?" And I said, "It's Bobby Henderson." He says, "How do you know that?" And I said, "Well, because when I was 15, or maybe 16, my mother gave me a birthday present, which was a record called A Night at Count Basie's. And Bobby Henderson was on it, and he sounds unlike anybody. He's totally unique." He said, "That's right, that was a great record," and blah, blah, blah. He says, I found Bobby. He's been lost for all these years. I found him." And I said, "Where was he?" He was in Albany, New York. And he said, "But I can't get him recorded. CBS won't do that. They don't care about some old guy who's playing in Albany, New York." And I said, "Well, I know a place we can record him. If you want to get him down here, we can record him at Sherman Fairchild's house." He says, "Could you really do that?" And I said, "Well, sure we can." He said, "Well, make a phone call, figure it out." So I called Sherman and said, "Hey, Sherman, we've got a guy here. I lied, I cheated. I said he's a cross between Art Tatum and Fats Waller, because I knew that Sherman really liked Art Tatum and Fats Waller. I says, he's older and he's sick, and we got to get him recorded." He says, "Bring him by, do whatever you need to do, get him over here." I said, "Okay." So Bobby came down. He stayed at my house because it was free, on my couch, and we. His lung cancer was so advanced that he could play a tune, rest for 10 minutes, play another tune, rest for 10 minutes. And I mean, he was absolutely phenomenal. He couldn't play fast any longer. Nothing is faster than a medium tempo tune, but it just all worked. It was beautiful stuff, and it ultimately came out as the second Halcyon release, the and it got 5 stars in downbeat and all that kind of thing. The first Halcyon release was Earl Hines, and that was a thing that we cooked up with Stanley Dance, and I had suggested to Stanley that it would be wonderful to take Earl and have him recreate the 8 QRS solos. And we did. I remember that they had recently been reissued on Milestone, Oren's label, and Stanley pitched the idea to Earl. Earl thought it was fine, and a date was set. It was a Sunday, and I remember that he flew in on a Sunday morning from Toronto, where he was playing, and he had played that night probably till 2 or something in the morning. Got a little sleep, got an early flight, came into New York City, came to the studio, perfectly, immaculately attired like he always was. You never saw Earl, dressed badly. And he was ready to go, and Marion was there, and Sherman was there, and Stanley was there, and I had brought a LP of all the 8 QRS solos so that he could listen to it, because he didn't play any of them anymore. He played blues and thirds, and maybe one other, Caution Blues or something like that. Anyway, he came in, messed around at the piano just a little bit, and I played him the first tune, and he says, and we repeated that thing 8 times. That I'd play him the record, he'd sit down and play it all, except he would take it and expand it and make it 7 minutes or 8 minutes or whatever. And he hadn't played 6 of those songs in 100 years, and he just tore it up. And this was the first of about 12 LPs that I made with Earl, and except for the one record that I made with Earl where it was on location, where I was with him for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 5 days. And all those records I made with Earl Hines, I do not have a single alternate take. He never made a mistake. Or if he worked himself into a box, he always had a way to work his way out. And so there are no alternates on that record that we wound up calling the quintessential recording session, because that said QRS. We subsequently made another one in about 1974 or maybe 73, and then we made a final one about 2 years later. The second QRS, or quintessential record, had other solos that he had done, Child of a Disordered Brain and things like that, reworking them, Deep Forest or whatever. And then the last one was, he wrote 4 originals and recorded all 4 of the originals. And he wrote all these things out. I actually used the scores that he had written out as the inside of the double fold album. And I remember meeting him up at the Wellington Hotel. That's where he stayed. And we were in the coffee shop, and we were trying to figure out titles for the songs. And Earl wanted a cup of coffee. Waitress came over. She brought him the coffee, and he said, "Do you have some sugar?" And the waitress brings over a little container of Sweet and Low or Nutri-Sweet, you know, those artificial flavors. And he looked at her and he says, "Baby, don't bring me none of that jive sugar." And that was the title of the last song, Jive Sugar Blues. And anyway, but in the beginning years of Chiaroscuro, we made those first two. Then we did a wonderful record with Marion. See, we had already done one record with Marion. With what's his name, Michael Moore, and no, the first one was with
Bucky
Link Milliman.
Calabrese, I think.
No, it was just a duo, and it was called Interplay, and quite wonderful. And then we made one for this new series, which is the one that had Michael Moore on it. It was called Ambience. And about the same time, I went out and recorded using Sherman's machine and Bobby Hackett's machine, recorded about 10 nights at the Roosevelt Grill of Hackett, Vic Dickinson, Dave McKenna, Jack Lestberg, and Cliff Lehman, except on one night when Milt Hinton took Lestberg's place. And I had asked Eddie Condon to come down and make announcements and stuff like that. And then, because Don Yule had been coming back and forth to my house and sleeping there because he was playing duets with Willie the Lion Smith at the Village Gate, I suggested to Don that he should come up and do a recording. And that would have been about 1969.